Icon Church Leadership Podcast. My name is Ilona. I'm the Operations Director at Icon, and I'm here with Justin Anderson, our lead pastor, and we are in Season 3 on Leadership Reentry. We are doing this podcast because we believe that investing in leaders is what makes the church thrive. And so Season 3 is all about that, really focusing specifically on our leaders.
Yeah. So last season, we kind of ran the leadership podcast parallel with the sermon series. And this season, we want to be really specific for you leaders out there. And so that can mean leaders at Icon and community group leaders, you're leading in ministry. But I know a lot of you lead in your workplace or you lead at home. There's a lot of different kind of leadership capacities. And we want to focus really specifically on you and you during this specific season, which, for context, we are in the summer of 2020. We are in the middle, we think, of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And all the conversation right now is about reentry. Okay, and so as we look towards the fall and possibly getting back to normal, whatever normal is going to look like, we want to get prepared now, here in July, for what will be true perhaps in September or October, because by the time we get to reentry, it's too late to be ready for reentry. So the two questions we want to ask during this season, and we're going to do it in a kind of a variety of different ways, is, am I healthy or are we healthy? And then, am I ready or are we ready? Okay, and so that's kind of the framework for this season as we envision what it's going to look like to lead our teams into reentry.
Absolutely. And so the first two episodes of Season 3 really are at the individual look. So we're thinking about me as an individual person. Am I healthy? Am I ready? And so today specifically, we're going to look at that idea of health. And we're going to look at three categories: physical, mental and emotional, and then spiritual. And we'll offer you a bunch of questions to kind of think through what health looks like, and then some really practical ways to think about how to respond to unhealth. So if you're not doing well across any of those categories, what should you do? So we'll be using that as our framework today.
Yeah, and I would encourage you, think about where you're at today on these issues of physical, spiritual, and mental, emotional, compared to where you were 3 months ago at the beginning of the lockdowns and as all of this was happening, right? So Are we feeling better or worse? Are we feeling spiritually more vitality or less? Like that, I think that can be a good control comparison because it sets a trajectory, and that's the trajectory that you're on going into reentry. So as we ask these questions, and really want you to think about them and do a little bit of a diagnostic on yourself, but do so to go, okay, I'm feeling this now. How does that compare to where I was at in, say, February, March, or April, as opposed to now May, June, July?
Absolutely. So first category we're going to look at is the idea of physical health. So questions that you might ask yourself. Number one, how's your energy level? Do you actually have the energy to do the types of things that you love and enjoy? Are you sleeping? Are you sleeping regularly? Do you get enough sleep? And then lastly, thinking about like physical health habits. So in terms of exercise, eating, your weight gain or loss. Have you noticed significant interruptions to some of those habits in your life? So those would be the diagnostic questions to ask yourself.
Yeah, and I would write down those categories and force yourself to go through the process. Stuff like this, is only as useful as you actually execute it, right? So write these things down and go, okay, how has my sleep been? What is the positive? Am I sleeping well but not enough? Or am I sleeping a lot of hours but it's kind of fitful? Or am I going to bed later and sleeping in later? I know that was something for me that I really struggled with at the beginning of this. My wife, Emily, is a night owl, and so it is always, it takes all of my effort to get us to bed before midnight. And then when you take away the need to get up in the morning because everything is delayed, we just found ourselves getting to bed later and later and later, and then waking up later and later and later. So recently, when my gym reopened and I could get up and I had something to get up for, man, it has made a huge difference in these last 3 weeks just to have a reason to get up at 5:45, because I'm sorry, Jesus' time was not enough. It just wasn't happening, right? Like now I'm getting up at 5:45, I've got devotional time, I'm at the gym at 7, it's great, but it was not happening, and it was a slow burn. So that was something that was helpful for me to kind of compare and contrast, that kind of February, March, April, as opposed to May, June, July. So really do the work of assessing where are you at physically.
Yeah, and I kind of a shameless plug here, as you're doing that evaluation and looking at those habits, think about the idea of an ideal week. We'll have a resource on our show notes about this, but essentially map out where am I spending my time and where have I lost, again, as you evaluate. Where have I lost some of those really important habits, the things that I love, creating space for that. So would encourage you to take advantage of that.
Yeah. All right, let's shift to mental, emotional. So here's the questions. Are you experiencing fear and anxiety in ways that, exceed what you had been before? How would you rate your level of stress? Do your emotional responses match the external stimulus? Or as some people say, are you experiencing outsized emotional response where just a little stress poke causes Mount Vesuvius to erupt? Yes. How are your relationships? How's communication with those people? Who are you seeing and spending time with, right? Like that would be an interesting thing to think about. Who was your quarantine at the beginning of all of this?
Is it quarantine?
Yeah.
That's fun.
Yeah. I probably made it up. So who is your quarantine at the beginning of this time? Who is it now? Has that changed? Why has that changed? Is that better? Have you weeded some people off your team? Have you cut some members? What's that look like? Who are you seeing and spending time with? Are those relationships healthy? And are they people who are fueling you? Family, spouse, significant other, community. Now, some of those people you can't quit, right? Or like you're not supposed to. But like you need to do an assessment of like, okay, where is my relationship with my spouse right now? Or how has my tolerance for my kids, tolerance is probably not the right word. How has my love changed for my children over time, right? So that kind of mental, emotional, relational world, right? Like how are we assessing the health of that? And I'll add this, as you think forward to kind of starting to regather, whether that's at work or at church or whatever, are you looking forward to that? Or are you kind of dreading that? Like, has it been kind of nice to not see some people? And who are they, and name them, right?
Name them to yourself, I think is fine. But as you ask yourself those questions, again, we'd encourage you to take the time, write this out, really process through it. And think about, again, the ways that you respond to that unhealth. And so that might be you set aside a half day for kind of some solitude to reflect on these types of things, and then walk out of it thinking about kind of the relational implications. If you've noticed kind of with your significant other, there's a gap in there, you schedule a date night, find a way to do that. If you're not really sure kind of emotionally where you're at, or you are feeling some of those outsized emotional reactions, one tool that we love to use here is a feelings wheel.
How big is your wheel?
There's a lot of feelings on my wheel. But the idea being, get precise about what's actually going on. Until you can name it, there's no way that you're going to be able to address it. And so maybe if you're finally able to name that I'm feeling resentment, now I can do something about that. And to think about ways that you're going to actually be able to take tangible steps forward.
I'll ask you who you resent later.
Okay,
but let's transition to the third category.
Cool. The last one being spiritual. So thinking about these aspects in your life. So first big question to ask yourself is, what spiritual disciplines are you actually practicing? And if you're like, what's a spiritual discipline? And no, I'm not practicing it.
Season 2.
Oh, wow, on relational practices. It's like we were ready for you. So go and you could listen to that series. We've got resources on that. But think about what practices you actually used. Again, compare which ones did you use at the beginning and now have fallen off from. And think about what practices you might recommit to in the midst of kind of quarantine fading into reentry. Think about the way that the practice of not meeting with your church community has affected you. How has that been maybe a feeling of loss and the ways that you've kind of are missing that community? Again, if you're not missing it, what is that telling you? And then think about your level of your own spiritual vibrancy. So do you actually feel connected to the Lord? Do you feel like there's the presence of God in your everyday life and that you feel kind of hopeful and joyful as you engage life? Or do you feel hopeless and kind of despondent or feelings of despair, and really assessing that level of your spiritual health?
Yeah. And, we don't get super woo-woo here at Icon as a rule.
Can you define woo-woo?
Yeah, we don't talk a lot about like spiritual warfare and the spiritual realm and some of those things, and yet it's real, and that's something to pay attention to as well during this time. I mean, there are going to be ways in which we get out of balance because of mental and emotional and relational health. But also, those create little, as they say, footholds for spiritual attack and spiritual warfare to become reality, to exacerbate some of those problems. So, consider that as well in this diagnostic time. Are there ways in which I've allowed lies to enter into my life, and I've owned them and believed them, right? Go read Screw Tape Letters by a guy named C.S. Lewis, Clive Staples Lewis. It's a great book, but what it does is just opens your eyes to all the ways in which seemingly normal everyday moments in our lives can be opportunities for Satan to just tweak us 1%, just 1% away from what we ought to be, and then 1% over time becomes a really big gap. So I would really encourage you. I mean, we joke about going back to season 2, but this is what a rule of life is for. To build a structure in your life, to not, it's not a thing that saves you. It's not a thing that earns you, time with God or whatever. Like, God doesn't love you more if you have a rule of life, but a rule of life will help you love God more, right? Because it owns the day in a way that it can just get away from you. And I will own, for me, that happened in the kind of middle months of this thing, probably May, June in particular. I felt like my whole day, every week, was just a kind of a blob of nothingness. Like, it just kind of, one thing floated into the next. And it was because I largely lost that vision for a rule of life. Like, nope, this is what I do. This is where I'm going. This is what life's going to look like. And all of the outside things that were helping kind of prop up that life fell away. And I realized, like, oh, they were crutches in many ways. And when they fell away, my life kind of fell apart as strong, but it kind of got blobby, you know what I mean? And so as some of those structures are coming back, I'm noticing, wow, okay, it's much easier to get up in the morning, do devotions, have some quiet time, get to work out, get to work on time-ish, and that it just helps. So building that rule of life is super, super helpful as well.
Absolutely. And so again, we would encourage you to take the time to actually think through these. So we've talked about physical, mental and emotional, spiritual, and on our website, iconchurch.org/leadership podcast, we're going to have all of these questions for you, and would encourage you, really take the time to go, to reflect, to write them out, and really assess, how are you doing? Where are you healthy? Where are you not healthy? And what are you going to do about it?
Yeah. So during our season 2 Rule of Life sermon series and the podcast series, we talked a lot about the practice of spiritual disciplines prepares you for the game, right? By the time you're in the game, it's too late. Whatever you are, you're done, right? You cannot get better in the game, in the moment. And we're about to be in a moment of reentry where a lot of things are going to change about the teams we lead, the community groups we lead, the families we lead. A lot's going to change in the next couple of months. And by the time we hit September, October, it will be too late. You will only be able to lead insofar as you have prepared yourself to do so. Now is that time. So, man, take this seriously, like this diagnostic step of asking yourself that question, where am I? Am I healthy? How is my health deteriorated? What categories have deteriorated? How has my health actually improved in some other categories? How can we keep that going? What are some solves for the other? Do that work, write it down, force yourself to actually take the time to think about it. If you just kind of generically think, you'll get generic answers, right? But if you sit down, actually do the work category by category and ask yourself, okay, how has my sleep been? And make yourself think about it and write that down. You will get so much more out of this diagnostic process, and you'll be better prepared to walk forward into health in those areas.
Absolutely. So thanks so much for tuning in this week. Again, go to iconchurch.org/leadership podcast for the show notes and the opportunity to do this diagnostic. And then wherever you're getting this content, rate it, subscribe to it, share it, help other leaders around you assess their own health in this season. And we'll see you next time.